I have to once again address this contingent of people out there who are banging on about how Tyson Fury was so hard done by getting stripped by the IBF, and that Anthony Joshua is a paper champion. He's not the real champion. They don't want to give him any credit for beating Charles Martin, winning the world title after, 16, 17 fights. They don't want to give him any credit for any of that. They just want to go on about how he's a paper champion, how the belt shouldn't have been stripped from Fury. Fury was hard done by, all this type of stuff. As I explained in the previous video I made about this, Fury was not hard done by. Fury decided to make the extremely unusual decision of signing for a rematch when he was the mandatory challenger to face Vladimir Klitschko. That is extremely unusual. It's he who acted in an unusual fashion, not the IBF. The IBF were just following their own rules. And there was a conflict there between the IBF enforcing their mandatory, which they're very strict about. Just ask Kell Brook how strict the IBF are when it comes to enforcing their mandatories. There was a conflict between them enforcing the mandatory and Vladimir Klitschko enforcing his rematch clause, which Tyson Fury shouldn't have signed. You don't have to sign a contract with a rematch clause in it if you're a mandatory challenger. Again, I have to reiterate, in over 25 years of watching the sport of boxing, I have never before come across a mandatory challenger who voluntarily went ahead and forfeited his right, his privilege of not having to sign for a rematch against the champion. Fury's the first guy I've ever come across that's done that in over 25 years. Now, I'm not saying there's nobody else that's done it in the past 25, 27 years, but I can't recall anything like that. That's why it was so unusual when Tyson Fury did it. What a strange thing to do. And it's that very odd move by Tyson Fury, which is the reason that he got stripped. Not no skullduggery, not the IBF acting unethically. No, it was Tyson Fury's very own decision, which cost him that IBF title. He has nobody else to blame but himself. As far as Joshua being this paper champion because Tyson Fury is the linear champion, we all know Tyson Fury is the man who beat the man. We all know that. Nobody's disputing that. But let's not blow this whole paper champion thing up into something that it's really not. There have been multiple world champions in boxing for God knows how long now. Pretty much since the beginning of the sport, to be honest with you. There were always different sanctioning bodies which recognize this person or that person as the champion. They've always been. But probably from the maybe 50s, 60s onwards, there started being more of them. The New York State Athletic Commission, they were recognizing a world champion at one point when the other sanctioning bodies weren't necessarily recognizing the same guy. The WBA and the WBC came around in the early 60s, and the IBF came around in the early 80s, the WBO in the late 80s, so on and so forth. So for a very long time now, there has been multiple world champions in the heavyweight division and in all the divisions. And there's only ever been one linear guy out of all those world champions. You go back to the golden age. People keep criticizing my assertion that we're entering a new golden age of the heavyweight division. Okay, well, let's go and look at one of the ages which we can all agree was a golden age for heavyweight boxing, the late 60s/70s, when Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier and George Foreman and Ken Norton and all those guys were around. Did they have one world champion then? Well, actually, no. Muhammad Ali was stripped of the world title. Okay, we know why he was stripped, for political reasons. His political objections to the Vietnam War. He was stripped of the world title. And in his absence, in his hiatus, because he was banned from boxing for 3.5 years, they had a tournament to basically fight for Muhammad Ali's vacant world title. The WBA and the WBC were involved, and through the elimination process, Joe Frazier became the champion without ever having beaten Muhammad Ali when he became champion. Jimmy Ellis was, I believe he was he the WBC? I think Jimmy Ellis was the WBC champion or the WBA champion. I forget now. But either way, Jimmy Ellis was not the linear champion. He didn't beat anyone especially good to become world champion. And that was back in the golden age. Yeah? So people acting as though what's happening now is so terrible. Well, it's always been happening. Larry Holmes, he won a vacant world title against Ken Norton. A title that was stripped from Leon Spinks after Leon Spinks beat Muhammad Ali. So Leon Spinks was the linear world champion. But he had the WBC title stripped from him for failing to face the mandatory challenger Ken Norton. Then in stepped Larry Holmes and him and Norton squared off for the vacant belt. So you got all these guys winning vacant titles back in the golden age. Larry Holmes only had one world title for the majority of his heavyweight reign. The WBC and later on the IBF. You know, you look at Mike Tyson when he came on the scene, he didn't fight the linear champion when he first became a world champion. He fought Trevor Berbick, who was a weak champion, Bone Crusher Smith, who was a weak champion, beat Pinkland Thomas, and then he beat Tony Tucker, who was a good fighter. You know, nothing exceptional, but he was a good fighter. It wasn't until Mike Tyson fought Michael Spinks that he actually fought for the linear heavyweight title. Spinks was actually the man who beat the man who beat the man who beat the man. But just because a guy is the linear champion, it doesn't mean he's going to be necessarily the best guy in the division. And that goes for Tyson Fury right now. Tyson Fury on paper is the number one, and rightfully so. Because he beat Vladimir Klitschko, who was a very long reigning dominant champion. But that don't mean that Tyson Fury can beat all these guys out here. Not at all. Who's to say he won't be another Leon Spinks? Who's to say he won't be another Michael Spinks? A guy who was the linear champion, who did beat Larry Holmes, although controversially, particularly the second time. The guy who was the linear champion, when he stepped in against Mike Tyson, fucking hell. A guy who was the linear champion, when he stepped in against Mike Tyson, he got blown away in a round. So these people calling AJ the paper champion, was Mike Tyson the paper champion? When he beat Trevor Berbick and beat Bone Crusher Smith and Tony Tucker, was he the paper champion? Because he wasn't the linear champion. Spinks was a linear champion. But I can tell you something, at the time, there were some people who viewed Spinks as the true champion, but most people were like, you know what? Forget this linear stuff. Mike Tyson's clearly just better than Michael Spinks, and he's more proven than Michael Spinks. Now, granted, Anthony Joshua is not very proven at heavyweight. Right? He's not that proven. He's not as proven as Tyson Fury is. But you take the Klitschko win aside, does Tyson Fury have an amazing resume? He beat Cunningham. That was a good win, although a very difficult win. Very difficult. And he couldn't outbox Steve Cunningham. That's why he turned it into the brawl that it turned out being. That's why he turned it into a physical fight, because he was struggling with Cunningham's movement and speed. People forget all this stuff. This is why I keep telling you guys, none of these fighters, Fury, Joshua, none of these guys are going to get out of this era unbeaten. It's not going to happen. Tyson Fury will lose. If he fights Ortiz, Joshua, Parker, a couple of the other guys, at least one of them is going to beat him. It's definitely going to happen. Fury is not the heavyweight Mayweather. He's just not. So, yeah. Anyway, long story short, my point in this video is, let's not start sensationalizing this whole thing with Joshua winning this title against Charles Martin. You know, he's a paper champ. Let's not start sensationalizing it. There's always been this in boxing, people. Lennox Lewis, when he first won a world title, he didn't win it in the ring. He won it by picking it out of a bin. Is he a paper champion? As I say, go back to the 70s. Was Frazier a paper champion? Well, when he first won the title, he didn't beat Muhammad Ali to get it. You had Jimmy Ellis out there. He never beat Ali. He never beat anyone especially good to become the champion. This is nothing new in boxing, people. Let's stop acting like little girls and screaming because Anthony Joshua hasn't beat Tyson Fury yet. You know, the IBF acted well within their rights. Why the hell should they change their rules to suit Tyson Fury? There are circumstances in which a champion can get an exemption to not have to face their mandatory challenger. And those exemptions are usually granted in the case of unifications. And in such instances, the champion will have to pay the mandatory challenger step-aside money. They call it step-aside money. They'll have to pay them step-aside money for the privilege of being able to postpone their mandatory defense. And obviously the mandatory challenger has to agree to accepting that step-aside money. So I can understand people saying, well, why didn't the IBF make an exception here? Why did Tyson Fury sign for the rematch? Again, it's not the IBF who are doing something unusual here. It's Tyson Fury. He's the one that for some bizarre reason signed for a rematch when he's the mandatory challenger and you don't have to when you're mandatory. So he's the one who's to blame for getting stripped of his IBF title. Nobody else. The IBF are just enforcing their strict mandatory policy, which they do throughout all the divisions. Would you prefer them to be like the WBC, who are allowing Canelo to put off his mandatory challenge against his mandatory challenge, fighting his mandatory challenger Golovkin indefinitely, it seems? Would you prefer them to do that? Because if they gave Tyson Fury, if the IBF gave Tyson Fury an exemption and said, okay, you don't have to fight your mandatory this time, we'll let you go fight Klitschko without paying your mandatory any money, then all of the IBF champions are going to be coming to them saying, hey, why don't you do that for me? I asked you for an exemption in similar circumstances to this and you didn't give it to me. How come you're giving Tyson Fury the exemption? Being this strict, the way the IBF are with their mandatories, yes, it does work out badly sometimes, but it also works out well sometimes. And at least they're consistent. Yeah, at least they're somewhat consistent when it comes to their mandatory policy. Unlike the other governing bodies who are just making up the rules as they go along, giving people exemptions willy-nilly when such an exemption doesn't even exist in their rule book. Although they've probably got some clause in their rule book which says they can make up the rules as they go along. Because that's what people like the WBC are doing. I mean, give me a break. I would much rather a system where a governing body strictly enforces their mandatories. Then you at least know where you stand if you're a mandatory challenger. So it is what it is. We've always had multiple, or for the majority of the existence of boxing, we've had multiple sanctioning bodies, multiple world champions, and there's only ever been one linear champion at any given time. So let's not blow this stuff out of proportion. Back in the 90s, which was another golden age for heavyweight boxing, we had loads of different champions. Only one of them was the linear champion, people. Was that a joke of an era because there was loads of different champions? No. Would we prefer to have one champion per division? Yes, we would. We would prefer to have one belt per division. But again, as I've already mentioned, just because a guy is linear champion, it don't mean he's necessarily the best. Ask Michael Spinks. Anyway, it's your boy Hatman, I'm out.